皆様、本日お集まりいただきありがとうございます。今回はですね、XR 最前線、アメリカ投資家 JP ミネトスが語る市場の今とこれからというのがテーマになっております。本日ですね、モデレーターを務めさせていただく原島と言います。ちょっとした自己紹介にはなるんですけれども、前職までですね、今はですね、今回XR 会議の方では、XR 横丁というところでですね、5階にですね、出展してますので、そこでB2C の会社様を集めて、これから B2B っていうところもあるので、そこを拡大していこうということで出展ブースを作っております。でそうですね、前職まではですね、メタの方でですね、VR の事業開発担当をしておりました。でその中で3年ほどいたんですけれども、その後ですね、ちょっと非常に XR に可能性を感じつつですね、もっと日本から、世界へっていうところに、広がっていくといいなと思って、今はですね海外の会社様だけでは、海外の人と日本をつなげるっていうことで、活動をですね広げております。でその中でですねJP とはですね、彼は投資家なんですけれども、非常にですねアメリカの今のXR の市場というところをですね非常に把握している、メンバーで、実際データの分析だったりっていったところも非常に得意なので、今回そういった情報に関して少しでも日本と海外のちょっと違いみたいなところを知っていただければなと思っております。はい、それではちょっと JP にこの後は引き継ぎます。
Hello. Oh, good. We are working. Do we have the translation? The translation is coming through. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Shun, for the introduction. A brief overview of myself. My name is JP Minetos. I work in venture capital at a firm called Hartmann Capital, where we invest into frontier technology such as VR, XR, generative AI, brain-computer interfacing, and general technology. But I specifically focus on the virtual reality ecosystem of what that looks like today, and as well as augmented reality. And I've worked with a lot of top teams in XR, either through direct investment or consulting, including some teams in Japan. I think you gave a pretty good introduction, so I think we can go ahead and get into the slides. So there is a lot going on in the spatial computing ecosystem. As you guys know, since you're here, you are very well familiar with some of the developments going on. But we only have 30 minutes today, so I'm going to try to compress in as much as I can. So at first, I want to clarify some terms because XR is a general catch-all term that doesn't describe things accurately. So I just wanted to separate our two parts of the talk, which are going to be focused on virtual reality and augmented reality and the differences between. So as you guys are well aware, virtual reality are fully immersive digital worlds versus augmented reality is a technology overlay onto base reality, things such as smart glasses versus virtual reality being full-blown immersive headsets. And we're going to talk about both today and where each one stands in the ecosystem and why I think there's room for both of them to coexist with each other. So I think this is the impression what a lot of people had of what VR was. You guys see Sword Art online there, right? Japanese anime, full dive VR. We saw it as everyone was going to be in the headset all the time, and that's how people were going to interact with XR. But that isn't really what we're seeing. This is a lot closer to what VR looks like today. Very social, focusing on teenagers, mostly in the North American market, but globally, using it as a social gaming device. You know, so what really is VR today? What does the VR market look like? Well, virtual reality is the $300 teleportation device to another world. And it might be the most social piece of technology to ever exist. So I want to share a story. In America, we have this term called the Gen Z stare, referring to the youth not being able to interact into the functional world. They don't know how to socialize. They don't know how to behave around others in the real world. But what is so fascinating is that completely goes away in the presence of virtual worlds, where they become incredibly social. And we have some of the data to back up that this is really what is being used in VR. This is how VR is being used. If we were to spend time looking at the most popular games this last month, 14 of 16 of the best-selling VR games are multiplayer and social. And some of these games are selling to tens of millions of users and making hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. So what's making these worlds so special in a place that people want to spend time in? Well, it's that VR has become the new playground. This is how kids in this main core demographic of users are using it. They're using it as the new play space in lieu of going to the mall after school or going to the playground. They are spending time embodied in virtual worlds with their friends. And when we look at these VR apps, when we look at the ones that are really winning, that are gaining a lot of market share and a lot of attention, we see a few commonalities. We see that they're free to play. We see that they're multiplayer, that they're really easy to share on social media, and that they're unique to VR. So I wanted to just briefly go over each one of these points and why they work so well. So first, free to play. This has become almost precedent within the broader games industry. I mean, such as Roblox, most experiences are free to play. Most mobile applications are. We've now had to move the monetization layer down. Attention has become so optimized. As you guys know, you have a device in your pocket that wants your attention all the time. For younger generations, this is even more true. So you have to be able to incentivize your users to come in and engage in the world. And we see that to be free to play as one of the best avenues for this. A sizable amount of the VR user base is actually price binary, meaning that you could discount an experience, a game, 99%, and they still wouldn't convert. They only will give it a shot if it's free to play. And we find that the user base on two very similar games, one is free to play, one is paid, at the very minimum, you're going to have a 10x in user difference in the number of users. We also see that it gives a higher quantity of opportunities to convert these users to be paid once they're inside. Someone who might have not taken the risk of buying a game up front may become retentive and eventually a paying customer. You have more opportunities along the way to build trust. And this is what we've seen with a lot of these top VR experiences. And even though this is true for the 13 to 17-year-old male demographic who primarily plays VR, we found this to be true even with older users. So multiplayer first. I know we already sort of touched on this, but it really is a difficult part to overstate because it just is so important, right? The Quest is such a cheap way to embody and teleport into another world. And we found that being in virtual worlds are a lot more enjoyable when they're being spent with friends. And you know, why is that? One, users feel like they're there, that they have a level of social aptitude that would be equivalent to being in the real world. We found that social gameplay, especially amongst kids, it's almost like free updates and live services to games, where kids will come in and they will make their own games. They treat these worlds as sandboxes to then come up with their own ideas in the way they want to do things. There's a heavy social growth effect in VR, as true with many consumer apps, which is, hey, come play this game with me, where you have one user in a friend group, one player who then goes and tells the rest of the friend group to come and enjoy. And if it's free, it's a pretty low ask to have, so long as you have the required devices. In the social worlds just create less opportunities for users to feel bored or isolated inside. One other thing I wanted to talk about here was the unique locomotion. all the time, your attention is being stripped away from you from very good devices, from the mobile phone to social media to everything in the real world to traditional consoles. How do you convince somebody to stay inside? And we found that part of being teleported to another world is having motion that feels like you're in another space. So unique locomotion to VR, where you're able to physically move and interact inside, has become a really big customer moat to keeping people in VR because they can't have that experience anywhere else. This great movement and feedback is very convincing to this teleportation idea. But even more so than VR, where they're already very retentive, where these users are spending long days inside and coming back multiple times, there is still a sector where they are spending more time in, which is social media. And so it's become pivotal for these games and experiences to work really well in social media. So a lot of the best VR experiences are designed not necessarily to only be fun to play in VR, but work really well when being watched on TikTok or YouTube. So here's an example. These are two teams in VR that I've seen really crush it and get a lot of attention on these short form algorithms, most of them with millions of views. So we find that this has generated a lot of sales and a lot of interest for getting into these worlds with content directly made by the studios. And we've also found that worlds that users can create content in generate a lot of attention as well. I wanted to give an example. So this is one of the biggest VR games. It's called Gorilla Tag. Over 15 million users lifetime, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. One promise that they make to their users is that you will get views for it. They don't literally make this promise, but because it's popular, people are willing to watch content on it. A lot of these users are tying their social identity to their digital identity. In a previous world where having the best new shoes was a sign of social status, this exists now virtually because this is where they're spending more time in. And part of this is generating social capital through being a YouTuber or making channels. And it's a cyclical process that ends up helping both the creator and the developer. So this is an example here for Gorilla Tag. This is on my personal YouTube channel. I made a short story. It was a 30-second stories about how I hurt myself by punching my wall in VR, and it got about 500,000 views. And this was really impactful for me because this gave a big boost to my channel, as well as it got 400,000 free eyeballs to Gorilla Tag that they didn't have to pay for, and then garnered interest onto the platform. It kind of expanding too on this digital identity. I think this is one of the most important parts to understand is your identity is very much tied to your status for these users. So this social status comes from cosmetics in game. It comes from how good you are. It comes from your friend groups. And these are all expressions of you outside of your physical body. We see this like true in Roblox as well, where cosmetics are the #1 purchasable happening. And these are generating a meaningful revenue for these studios. And the thing is, these worlds are just continuing to get bigger. You guys are familiar probably with VR chat, right? This is sort of the classic VR world. At any given time, there's about as many people in VR chat that live in Shibuya's residential core. So it really is a living social virtual city. If you could just imagine the entirety of Shibuya online in a virtual world, that's where that is. And if we were to look at Gorilla Tag's lifetime users, the lifetime users of Gorilla Tag is about equal to the entire metro area of Tokyo's residents. These are pretty significant and meaningful worlds where these users are coming and spending time in. And I think relative to other tech forms, I think VR is still very early in the adoption cycle. I think we're now starting to enter the early majority phase, where the youth and the core demographic is starting to use it more. It's becoming a household name where people would recognize, but still not everyone is on it. I don't think you're going to see many 56-year-olds on it in the same way they would use a smartphone, but this core demographic is using it, and as they continue to age up, they are still using it and having these experiences. So just to summarize the state of what's really working in virtual reality right now is that it is growing, and it's being adopted mostly by teenagers. And these social worlds are really what the killer feature is for VR. They generate lots of views on social media, and VR currently is most adopted for entertainment and social immersion. That's kind of the overview on the VR side. But now what if we were to go and look at augmented reality? I mean, this has become a big talking point now with Mark Zuckerberg and Meta revealing their new Meta smart glasses. I think a lot of people are getting interest on it. So what's the deal with augmented reality? So I think the lens that we look through for augmented reality is a lot different than the one we look through for virtual reality. So humans have always used tools to augment our capabilities. This is what makes us a very special species compared to everyone else on Earth, is we've used tools to leverage our output and the things we've been able to do. We've used the pickaxe to mine ores. We used the printing press to be able to remember information. And we used the phone to be able to communicate with each other everywhere. And these tools have really been what has progressed us as a society. And we've recently unlocked the most powerful information tool in human history, which is artificial intelligence. But when we interact with these tools, there's always been an input lag on effort and information. It requires a lot of work to be able to do these things, and you have to know how to use the tool. Augmented reality allows humans to have a near real-time field of knowledge. And this is maybe the first time where we've been able to interact with the technology without having to think about using the technology. So what does that actually mean? What does AR do? Well, you stream the world's knowledge into your perception. And it gives you just-in-time context instead of manual search. You're able to actually embody the world around you and have it synthesized with your information in your context of the world. And it feels like calling an API for reality. And that's the way I like to think about it, is that we've now entered the API era for the brain. Smart glasses and augmented reality give AI a multimodal contextual view of your world, your eyes, your ears, your context. If you have a pair of glasses that follow you around on your point of view, it's seeing what you're seeing, it's hearing what you're hearing, and it has the memory context of knowing you personally and the context that defines your life. And so how are we seeing AR being used today, considering it's still pretty early? So these are the few applications that have me excited right now. We have AI note takers, which is you could be in a meeting and record the audio or transcribe, so then later you could recall what somebody said in context, or you could understand maybe 6 months later you wanted to remember something someone said, you could look back and reference it. We're using it for captions. As you guys can tell, I am an English speaker and not a Japanese speaker. Right now, there's a lot of work being done on having real-time translation. So you could speak in your language, I could speak in mine, and we can understand each other in real time. We're seeing a rise too in communication away from the smartphone to where you have a more ambient level of compute where you would just be able to message in real time without having to interface with your phone. And then maybe most importantly, we're seeing the augmentation of the mind to be able to have a high level skill without actually developing that skill. This is just an example I shared of a poker application. Imagine you could be so good at poker to be like a professional without any of that knowledge. Augmented reality would enable that by understanding your context and being able to feed you the right information. And as a species, we are becoming less reliant on our internal knowledge. We can now afford to offload our mental compute And knowledge becomes something that exists in ambient space, shared amongst all humans, rather than stored locally. And I think not knowing something is going to be a phrase of the past. In the future, not knowing something will be a rather rare occurrence. So if augmented reality is this super technology, why hasn't it taken off yet? I still think there's some outstanding issues with AR. In San Francisco, there's this term for investing that hardware is hard, right? Because it's so difficult to make really good hardware. Trying to fit in the thermals, the optics, the connectivity into a pair of glasses that weighs less than 50 grams is a very difficult task to be something that can be comfortable and wear all day. As well, we do see input lag, being able to have all the infrastructure. This is still a relatively early device, and there's a lot of tinkering going on with it, and we're now starting to see consumer products, but the technology isn't as far along as virtual reality is. I would say this is closer to where AR adoption looks like, where you're now just starting to see consumer products get to market and become usable. I think it's going to be probably around 2030 when this enters the early majority phase, closer to virtual reality. So to summarize this argument of VR versus AR, it really is one augmentation stack, where VR is focused on identity, play, in deeply social worlds and immersive experiences, and augmented reality is more focused on knowledge, assistance, real-time context, and augmenting your brain. And I think these are not competitors, they're more so complementary layers. But either way, it's a very exciting time, and there have been major developments in both. And I think that in the next 5 years, we're going to continue to see meaningful advancements in both. So arigato, and thank you for coming, and I think we will open the floor to questions and answers. Thank you.
そうですね、この後は、Q&A セッションに移りたいと思いますので、そうですね、ご質問がある方がいらっしゃいましたら、マイクの方をですね、はい、スタッフの方がお渡しするので、はい、挙手をいただければと思います。
Thank you for your presentation. It was very good and very informative. I noticed you talked mostly about the consumer applications. Do you have any information about the enterprise applications, like the B2B?
Do you want to translate that into Japanese?
はい、今のご質問なんですけれども、コンシューマー、そうですね、ベースの今のお話、中心のお話だったんですけれども、エンタープライズの方に関して、どういう考えがありますかみたいなところでした。はい、それに対してちょっと JP の方で回答します。
Well, thank you for your question. This talk was focused more so on the consumer side. I think this is where a lot of my personal interest has been and where I've seen a lot of adoption. And I did not really spend a lot of time on B2B, but there have been some meaningful improvements on the B2B side. Because these are simulated virtual worlds, we're thinking about it within a social context of where you're coming to play, but this also means that you could simulate other forms of reality. Imagine instead of having to be on an airplane to understand how it works, you could simulate that and see it inside. If you want to lay out a factory and see how the factory works, if you want to perform a risky procedure on someone, you could simulate that without risking somebody's life. We have started to see pretty meaningful B2B interactions. And I think oftentimes these lurk in the shadows because they don't get as much press and coverage. I think there have been a few companies who have done this very well. And what typically works is owning a simulation niche. So where I see B2B best working is simulation training for onboarding and training workers to be able to perform a task. I've seen it mostly work with where the real world counterpart would be very capital intensive to do. Instead, you could save a lot of money by doing it in VR. And there's been a number of companies here who have raised a lot of money in this space. I'm definitely excited about it, but I actually think that the adoption right now is lower than consumer is. But going forward, I do think B2B will continue to play a bigger part in the virtual reality ecosystem.
はい、ちょっと要約をできればなと思っております。もともとJP としての、本人としての興味というところが、B2C のところから始まってますというところです。ただですね、確実にそういった形で、B2B っていうところも、伸びてきているっていうところで、そこが実際例えば、彼が言ってたのが、シミュレーターみたいな形で、工場であったりとか、例えば、手術だったりとか飛行機だったりってそういった場面っていうのは見えてきてますと。でそこがですね、そもそも B2C と B2B だと B2B の方が、メディアの、そのカバーするプレスのカバーする、比率が全然違うっていうところなんですけど、今、いくつかの会社で実際成功例として、結構そのニッチな実際比較的ニッチなところを攻めてる B2B っていうのは、いい形でしっかりマネタイズができているというところです。でなので、B2B の、に関して言うと、結構もともと実際やるのであればシミュレーションにおいても実際やると結構お金かかるみたいなところを、XR を、活用することによって、コストも、防ぐことができるみたいなところっていうのは良いのかなというところです。で今は B2C っていうところがメインにはなっているものの、今後間違いなく B2B っていうところは大きくなっていくっていうのが、彼の見解でした。はい、その他どなたかご質問ある方いらっしゃいましたら。例えば投資家なので、投資分野に関して今彼が例えばどういったところに注目しているのかみたいなところも含めて、アメリカにおいてはどういったところをフォーカスしているのかみたいなところも面白いのかなっていうふうに思ったりするので、はい、そういったことも、僕から聞いても全然大丈夫ですし、はい。
Yes, so what we are looking for as an investment firm is not just within this space. This is a space that I care a lot about and I focus a lot about, but we are really spending a lot of time generally on human augmentation. So this has been a more recent focus for us, is understanding what happens, how do we make humans better? So this has been the question that we've been asking internally, and we're firm believers that this is done through technology. So things that we've started spending a lot of time focusing on have been the areas that we discussed today, but we've also spent a lot of time within AI tooling to increase your output and your knowledge base. We started also looking at brain-computer interfacing to saying, well, how can we access the brain? How can we improve brain health? And how can we unlock that and focus on extending the quality of our lives? So these have been the questions that we have spent a lot of time thinking about and working on. Most of our most recent deals have been within AI tooling. So if you could think about this, mostly from B2B software, a recent deal we did allows you to edit game engine code using AI. So you could speak in natural language, and instead of having to write it in C#, the code would automatically be generated for you, reducing your input time by 90%. So things that are expediting how fast humans can do things and how well they can do it.
How about like XR?
Oh, XR.
Yeah,
Oh,
I also wanted to ask you about that, but like, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so within XR, our most exciting XR investment this year was into a company called Mentra. And what Mentra does is they are building the operating system for smart glasses. They want to make the Windows for smart glasses technology. So this was an investment that we did earlier in the year. Their core philosophy was that you cannot depend on corporations to figure out how people are going to use AR. You need to let the innovators and developers go and tinker with it. And they believed, and as do we, that AR is getting to a point where consumers can start adopting it. So this now allows for developers to have hackathons and to build new projects and test and see new ideas. They're still pretty early, and they've just launched their own pair of smart glasses this year. But this is what's excited me most, because I think out of that company, you're going to see a lot of new AR products and a lot more killer use cases for why people would want to use augmented reality.
そうですね、今の、回答なんですけれども、ちょっと XR の分野と、それ以外っていうところでお話しできればなと思っています。で、今回、XR なので、XR に関して言うと、今年彼が所属しているハートマンキャピタルの方では、メントラに、投資をしてますと、そうですね、2025年の、前期の方で前半で投資をしたというところで、このオペレーティングシステムを作っているメントラさんに投資しましたと。で、メントラさんの考えとしては、基本的にその、会社とかにそういったシステムっていうのを任せるのではなくて、イノベーターだったりデベロッパーが、そのシステムっていうのを作るべきだっていう思想のもと、立ち上がっていると。で今それをですね元にそのオペレーティングシステムを元にハッカソンだったりっていうのをやっているっていうところで、メントラさんデバイスも出されているので、今後そういったところに非常に可能性っていうのを感じて投資をしていると、出資をしているっていうところになります。でそれ以外に関して言いますと、彼らのその考えとしては、会社としてはどうやったら人間をがより良くなるかみたいなところをベースに考えていて、それがそのテクノロジーを先進技術を通じてというふうに考えているので、いろいろと今で言うとAI のツールっていうことを中心に今見ていて、一つ彼が例に出していたのはこれは B2B のツールなんですけれども、ゲームのコードをコード書けなくても口頭で説明できるみたいなで書けるみたいなことっていうのにそうですね、そこの分野に今注力しているというところでした。はい。どうぞ。すみません。そしたらマイクをお願いしてもいいですか。
興味深いお話ありがとうございます。その話の中で一つあったのが、あれ入ってるかな、これ入ってるか。特にゴリラタグをはじめとしたソーシャルなVR、体験が刺さっているのが、その13歳から17歳くらいのいわゆる Gen Z の多分アメリカの男性の子どもたちが大きいと思うんですけれども、そこから一方でそういう人たちがやってるものを別の世代の人たちから見るとそれがなんか幼稚に見えたり全然面白くなさそうに見えたりとかしてその見下しているところとかもインターネットのいろんなところを見ると結構目に入ったりするんですけれどもそれがひっくり返ってその今のGen Z の層から外に広がっていくような兆しっていうのは見えてきたのかどうかっていうのがちょっと気になっているところで、というのもちょっと僕昔携帯のソーシャルゲームとかやってたんですけれども、それも昔はガラケーで遊ぶソーシャルゲームって結構ゲーム機で遊んでたゲーマーからはなんだポチポチするだけのこんなのゲームじゃないみたいなことをよく言われてたんですけれども、途中からパズドラとか出てきたあたりからひっくり返ってみんながやるものになったというのがあったんですけれども、そういうような転換みたいなのはあり得るのかそういう兆しは見えているのかっていうの。
Great question. I think it's a little bit different than mobile. So I think a lot of people try to compare VR to mobile, and I think a lot of the original belief was that virtual reality was going to replace the smartphone. But the issue is the smartphone is a very good device. It's nearly the perfect computing platform for everyday use. Virtual reality, I don't think, is going to replace the smartphone. And I actually don't see virtual reality being...
The question was not whether virtual reality will replace smartphone. It's just an analog of the process of expanding to the mass market from a specific niche market to a mass market.
So where I was going to go with this is when I say like replace, yeah, right. It's not going to replace, but like how does it scale? I don't think it's going to have the same sort of adoption curve that mobile did, where everyone was going to come on within a decade. I see it happening a lot more where you will have some side expansions to where I think you have Gen Z, Gen Alpha, of course, doing it. You've now started to see more millennials, and Meta has now made this a target for their VR headsets as well, where you'll still be able to age up to, say, the sub 40 age demographic. I think the way I see XR growing is within the same demo, and then that demo continues to age up, and they still retain usage on the headset. So over a 10-year period, if you were 18 still playing, at 28, they'll continue to play while the new 18-year-olds are playing as well. So the market comes from a growing and aging population.
You see a similar, it's closer to like Roblox, right?
Yeah, it's more similar to Roblox in adoption. Like Roblox is a massive platform, but it's very unlikely that you're going to have 60-year-olds starting to play Roblox. I think it's going to look more like games adoption. Even if we look back at games consoles, right? So gaming was relatively niche. You know, not everybody was gaming, and that's still true when we think about core console gaming, not mobile gaming. But even now, like take like 5th gen consoles, mostly used by teenagers. Now you have people in their late 20s, 30s, 40s who still game every day. I think that's going to follow a similar path for VR.
I see. Thank you.
Yes.
今ので回答として大丈夫そうですかね。
はい。
はい。
ありがとうございます。
まあちょっと今いろいろとちょっと内容が多かったんですけれども、You wanted to say like it's well like it's a little different than like the mobile.
Yes, it would follow much closer to game consoles than it would to mobile phones.
なのでこうまあゲームコンソールのまあこうちょっとまあ似てるスマートフォンのまあ動きというよりこうゲームのまあコンソールに近い形の流れかなと思っていて、まあちょっと彼らが言ってることとまあ今まで話してたこともちょっとまとめて言うとですね、こうまあ今ってこうアメリカにおいてはまあ初めてこう10代で実は意外とクエストが初めてのゲーム機だったりっていうところが多かったりするんですね。そうすると彼らはこうまあクエストで育っていくっていうので、ちょっと面白いことにまあこれが本当にまあ今じゃあクエストをこう1回プレイしてから、まあ、卒業して他のコンソールに行くかと思いきや、今だんだんですねこうまあ、クエストから実際クエストのゲームゴリラタグからまあ、例えばアニマルカンパニーみたいな形でクエストの中で成長していってるというか年を重ねながらっていうのがあって、まあ、ちょっとロブロックスっていう言葉もうちょっと例として出させていただいたんですけど、ロブロックスってもともと20年前だとほとんどが子供だったと。で今20年後になると半分が10代で残りはそれ以外っていうところで、まあ、こう要はロブロックスで育っていったっていうところで、今そういったのがですね、まあクエストにおいては見られているっていうことで、これがこう、まあ、いきなり60歳みたいな人がじゃあ入ってくるかっていうより、まあ、この育っていくっていうので年齢を重ねながらどんどんこう層っていうのが増えていくっていうのが、まあ、今見られてきてるっていうところです。はい、なので、まあ、今そういった流れが今見えてきているのが、今の、まあVR 市場になっております。はい。
はい、ありがとうございます。質問としてはですね、日本だからこそ日本の強みとか、なんかユニークで日本ここが面白いよみたいなことをお聞きしたくて、で質問の意図としては、今の話とかにもつながってくるんですけれども、AI と人間のインターフェースとして XR の可能性めちゃめちゃ面白いと思ってますし、僕お仕事としては教育っていう領域で今まさに日本のこの、メタクエストを使ってアンリアルエンジンで ゲームを作ったりとか、10歳からずっとアンリアルエンジン触ってきて今16歳の子とかが高校生とか大学生で、本当に日本にも今北米よりもやっぱり日本少子高齢化なので数は少ないけれども、もう日本のこれからめちゃめちゃ面白いと思っているので、そこを支援してます。でたださっきのメントラのスマートグラスとかメタのレイバンディスプレイにしても、日本にまだ来てないとかみたいな話があるときに、今後その可能性はあるんだけれども、日本もっとここ頑張った方がいいよっていう部分と、今日本ここ面白いよって思ってるようなところをお聞きできたら嬉しいです。お願いいたします。
Good question. So I think one of the strengths of Japan, I think it's true that the adoption has lagged. And in general, when we look at consumer tech adoption, when things are popular in the West, it typically takes 2 to 5 years for it to end up Japan becoming mainstream. That's been the general pattern that we've seen. And if I understand your question correctly, you're already having active developers. You have kids in here, 10 to 15, who are starting to build things in Unreal. I think where a lot of this comes from is investment from these platforms. So the modern VR ecosystem right now wouldn't exist without Meta's investment, at least on the consumer side. Their primary focus has not been on Asia, it has been on North America and Europe. And when we look at the user demographics of these games, it's about 70% American and then 30% Europe, Canada, Australia. I think Japan is going to be the natural extension of this. I think one thing holding Japan back right now is most of these experiences have been in English language in VR, and the Japanese market has been too isolated away. And so a lot of these games also are not localized, and the headset hasn't been sold or adopted as much. I think over the next few years, we're going to start seeing more of a VR presence in Japan. As for smart glasses, the Meta displays that just came out, they didn't even come with Japanese translation or the AI features. So a lot of these use cases for AR didn't even make sense in Japan. But once again, I think it's a time delay thing. I think within the next two to 5 years or so, I think it's going to start looking more similar to how the Western market looks today.
はい。そうですね、大体ですね、テクノロジーに関して、ここはですね、自分もメタに行った時に感じていた、そうですね、苦しみみたいなところなんですけども、まず、全体として、テクノロジーに関しては、アメリカを中心、から大体5年ぐらい、遅れが出てるっていうのが、情報に関してもっていうのがありますと。で、まずは、今後伸びていくっていう、キーとなるのはやはりプラットフォーマー側の、投資になると。でそこが、メタ、彼が出してたのはメタがいなかったら、ここまで市場としても大きくなっていなかったっていうところ、一方で彼らの注目っていうところが、北米っていうところが中心になって、あとは英語圏っていうのが非常に多いですと。でなので日本においては、かなりちょっと遅れて、でそして国としても結構島国っていうところもあって、なかなか情報が入ってこないっていうのはありますと。ただそもそも例えばレイバンディスプレイもメタレイバンディスプレイ今かけてるものもですね、発売日本にしていない、元のその前のメタのレイバンも発売してなかったりとか、そういった中でかつ日本語の例えば、サービスが機能がついてなかったりってなると、結構そこは苦しいところはあるかなと思いつつ、彼の中ではそれが2、3年後、そういった形でちょっと遅れてたんですけど、日本に来るっていうところはあるとは思うと。でちょっとここからは自分個人のところなんですけれども、そういった今まで情報っていうところが非常に海外に行かないとなかなか、海外に行けば確かに手に入れることはできるんですけれども、じゃあ、日本から 全員がそこに行ってできるのかっていうと、そこが難しいというところもあったので、それこそリアルに、逆にアメリカだったり、ヨーロッパからそういったことをやってる人を日本に呼び込んで、情報っていうのをなるべく差を縮めたいなっていうのがあって、今回、独立したっていうところもあったので、今後も会社としてはそういったその情報のまず格差っていうところを少なくしていく。そしてそこからあとはもう本当にクリエイティブなところっていうのはむしろ日本は非常に得意だと思うので、そこを補う、情報がないとどういった方向に進むかっていうのがなかなか見えないと思うので、そこをしっかりできれば必ず日本から世界へっていうところが達成できると思うので、そこは本当にこれからも会社として個人としては実現していきたいなと思っているところです。すみません、ちょっと感想個人も含めての回答でした。
ありがとうございました。個人の感想も含めてなんかご一緒できたら嬉しいなと思いました。ありがとうございました。
ということでちょうどお時間にもなりましたので、改めまして本日貴重なお時間ありがとうございました。
Thank you. I'm going to leave some of my business cards here. If you're interested in connecting with me, please either come see me or grab a card, and I'd be happy to have a discussion.
はい、名刺の方ここに置いておきますので、よかったら後でコネクトしましょうということでした。はい、でAirPods で通訳も同時通訳もできるんで、コミュニケーションも直接取れますということです。はい。